A Time to Stir, Columbia, 1968. Paul Cronin, editor. J. Plunky Branch, Columbia College Undergraduate Students Afro-American Society, Hamilton Hall occupier. Inside alienation, outside agitator. I arrived on campus in September 1965 as one of only 16 Black freshmen included in the approximately 800 students in the class of 1969, effectively doubling the number of Black students at Columbia College. We were a mixed group, prep school graduates, gifted athletes, recruits from down south, New Yorkers, and others. Doubtless, we were intended to add campus diversity while preparing ourselves to be leaders, but in many ways, we were outsiders who, by our very presence, became agents for change at Columbia. I was born and raised in the segregated city of Richmond, Virginia, once the capital of the Confederate States of America. At Columbia, I was surprised at how easily I adjusted to interactions with a multiracial student body. In dorm rooms, lobbies, and other social settings, I witnessed and participated in intense and enlightening debates with my fellow undergrad students on any number of subjects. Yet, there was one important residue from my upbringing. I had a few occasions to meet white people in Richmond. As Black kids, and especially Black males, we were taught not to look at white people in the eye. My Columbia friends would say to me, "I saw you on Broadway yesterday and waved, and you didn't wave back." The fact is that I wouldn't have even noticed them. I would walk into the crowded lines stand, the campus grill, but my eyes would only see Black people. My avoidance in looking at certain people in the eye, which was learned in Richmond, meant that when I arrived in New York, I had to teach myself to see white people. I came to Columbia planning to become a chemist and then return home to Richmond to work at the DuPont plant, better things for better living through chemistry, when the company was the company slogan. I had fallen in love with chemistry at age 9 when I found my father's college textbook and believed it to be a noble profession. And I would surely eventually invent some new synthetic that would help make people's lives better. But that career path would be altered by the arguments of my more politically astute and radical fellow students. While in Richmond, I had no experience in questioning the validity and value of the war in Vietnam. But at Columbia, I encountered an active cadre of anti-war activist students and faculty who challenged my thinking and my apathy. In conversations and debates about the origins and prosecution of the war, I became convinced that to become a chemist would mean I would likely end up making napalm and other weapons that would contribute to the military-industrial complex. Rather than taking a role in the killing of innocent people in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, I decided I would pursue a career in the liberal arts. In the mid-60s was the time maturing of the civil rights movement and the range of possibilities being explored in the Black community, as well as being discussed and debated by Black students at Columbia, was vast. Dr. Martin Luther King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, had gained national prominence, while groups such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, Congress for Racial Equality, and ever-present National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, had several local, state, and regional groups who were all organizing protests and political actions, as well as devising strategies which led to the movement's widespread impact. The SCLC was intent on maintaining a national movement, whereas SNCC and other groups focused mostly on more locally directed student-led activities. Some organizations emphasize voter registration in the South. Others tackle specific issues like employment, desegregation, and unfairness of the draft, and sending Black men to war. The Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, and later by the Black Panthers, advocated more aggressive confrontational strategies as alternatives to nonviolent protests. Black nationalists, Pan-Africanists, and cultural nationalists put forth different views and alternative pathways to achieve national, local, national, and international goals for Black people. We students were foot soldiers, a source of energy and political will that fueled the movement, and an important part of the debates and strategies being waged and executed. We also likely were to become some of the primary future beneficiaries of the push for voting rights and equal opportunity under the law. My early years at Columbia were some of the typical of undergrad student life, with their share of study, sex, drug, and rock and roll, and political activism, as well as meeting new people and exploring boundaries with local parental oversight. But some layers and concerns and activities were made specific to being Black at Columbia. Some of my Black classmates were totally committed to excelling at their academic endeavors, and some were establishing chapters of national fraternities. Some were enduring discrimination on football and basketball teams. Some were politically active, both on and off campus. Most were trying to find themselves and lay the groundwork for their careers. But all of us were part of a generation that had been repeatedly told, you have to do your absolute best at all times. You have to be better than everyone else, and not just for personal gain. For when you step out into the public, you are representing not just yourself, but your entire race. We were conspicuous examples of the talented 10th, whose role it was to become public intellectuals and Black leaders. Influenced by a range of new philosophies that destabilized some of the assumptions of my upbringing, I had my own personal issues with the alienation and distortion of having shifted my projected career from chemistry to who knew what. My own personal proclivity to push boundaries in social areas also complicated my relationship with fellow students, administrators, and campus politics. I was a social bad boy and a ladies' man. I started a dance band on campus, the Soul Syndicate, 14 pieces of driving soul, doing James Brown and Motown songs for college mixers and disco club audiences. Leading the band, my own infusion of Southern soul culture at the college, gave me a modicum of celebrity on campus. For in January 1968, at the end of the first semester of my junior year, I dropped out of Columbia. Few people knew at the time because I remained on campus and kept up most of my activities, still socializing, debating political philosophies, and leading the band. The war and civil rights were the twin overriding issues at the time. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, was the main largely white anti-war organization on campus, whereas Students for Afro-American Society, SAS, was the leading Black advocacy group. In the spring of 1968, the political topics were the presidential election, ending the war in Vietnam, and stopping Columbia's expansion into West Harlem. In April, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Our reaction on campus to the death of Dr. King was not as visceral, maybe not as physical as the people who rioted in the streets. But it charged us with the idea that we were going to come up with the intellectual justification for the coming revolution. If dark forces could kill Dr. King, a messenger of peace, then certainly other options to nonviolence had to be seriously considered. Nearly 3 weeks after King's assassination, a demonstration was planned to protest Columbia's building of a gymnasium in Morningside Park and the university's involvement in the war. The night before, Paul, my band's trombonist, arranged a meeting between Cicero, our drummer, who was also a leader of SAS, and Mark, the chairman of the Columbia's SDS chapter, to coordinate plans for their group's activities the next day. I wasn't at the gym site on April 23rd, and I don't remember how I got the information that SDS and SAS were staging a sit-in at Hamilton Hall. I just recall being crowded inside the lobby at Hamilton, with Dean Coleman, my advisor, trapped in his office, along with many others realizing that we would have to formulate coherent plans as to what to do next. How long should we stay? Would we stay? What were our demands? What would be the response of campus security and later the police? What might be the consequences to individual students? Would there be violence, and what would be our response to it? Stopping the gym and supporting Harlem was, for us in SAS, the primary issue, stoked in no small part by the death of Dr. King. SDS and other groups, meanwhile, had come in to support our progressive action and press for the university to suspend all support for the war. We were all in it together, Columbia men, Barnard women, Blacks, whites, and others. But inside Hamilton Hall, it quickly became clear that each group has a different emphasis. For SAS, civil rights dominated, whereas for SDS, it was the war. There were two different agendas, rallying support for Black struggles and creating a Syrian anti-war event. Maybe two different methodologies, one nonviolent and the other not necessarily so. I was not a part of the leadership and the discussion between SAS and SDS, so I don't know the details. But it was decided that the all-white protesters would depart and take over another building, leaving Hamilton Hall to SAS and the Blacks. Once we had Hamilton Hall to ourselves, the atmosphere was upbeat but serious. We were happy to be in control of our own agenda, imagery, and messaging, and from behind the building's barricaded doors, we issued our demands. Columbia must abandon its plan to build a gym. By doing so, we were pledging solidarity with Black causes across the nation, even the world. In those first hours, we set about the various tasks of securing the doors and windows, designating separate areas for women and men, and assigning other responsibilities. Operating one of the old style phone systems that had been my freshman work-study job, I assumed control of the main campus telephone switchboard located in the building. I manned the switchboard for 50 straight hours, fielding innumerable incoming calls to the college from the press, administrators, and parents, all of whom wanted to know what was going on, who was in control, when was the occupation going to end, and how. It was April, and the acceptance letters had just gone out to the incoming freshman class. So parents were calling to find out what would happen the next semester. Hamilton Hall was and still is the classroom building of the undergraduate population at Columbia. I told some of them there might not be a university here next year. When university administrators and the new media followed, I was the one who connected them to the SAS leadership. We were constantly in touch with the SDS and the strike coordinating committee, and discussions were ongoing about objectives and tactics. Nearly 100 people encamped and sleeping in a building that was not designated as a residence can be a massive challenge. But in some ways, this was an adventure, with us sometimes hanging out on the second floor balcony, waving and shouting to a throng of students and others crowded around below. Black students on the outside, as well as Harlem mothers, community church leaders, and civil rights leaders were all supported, bringing food, sleeping bags, and messages of encouragement. We regarded this as a powerful validation of our actions, despite the fact that the public relations spin of the Columbia administration made clear demarcation between students and outside agitators. They wanted it to appear that the protesters were being sustained by dangerous, dark external forces, people with a bigger agenda, like the destruction of the university. It was a convenient way of handling things, but of course we had nothing to do with the truth. Those outside agitators were our brothers and sisters. This was yet another example of Columbia's inability to understand precisely what the protests were about, and more specifically, how aggrieved we Black students were with the operations of the university. Like the white students in the other 4 buildings, we were given ultimatums to leave Hamilton Hall. Deadlines were set and passed. It was clear the standoff would come and end very soon. The administration and the police made it clear that the students would not be coddled or granted amnesty until they left peacefully, and that the outsiders and non-students would be deemed trespassers and thus handled differently from Columbia students. Because I was no longer registered at the college, I would not have been afforded the same leniency as a student. So I decided I would not stay until the confrontational conclusion. On the night before the end of the siege, under the cover of darkness, I slipped out of Hamilton Hall and left the campus, which, packed with police, was looking increasingly dangerous. The occupations came to a riotous end. Through the expulsion of the Blacks from Hamilton Hall was peaceful. Not even our SAS leaders were roughed up, even though we had understood that this was likely. Whatever came down, whether the cops came in by force or whether negotiated, the people who would most likely face retribution would be the student leaders. This is why during debates of Hamilton Hall, which we openly discussed the issues as a group, all final decisions ultimately were taken by the leadership. This was a democratic process, but as a group, we were happy to defer to those 3 or 4 men who stepped out in front because it became our public face. In the broader context, Black leaders have always been targeted. From the time of slavery through the 21st century, there's Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Marcus Garvey, Paul Robeson, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Stokely Carmichael, H.R. Brown, Fred Hampton, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and many others have paid dearly, some with their lives. We in the Black community have always been supportive of our leaders, those who sometimes have placed themselves at great risk to serve the greater good. Memory is a faulty tool for recall, especially for details, but there are things I won't forget. The lessons learned constituted a turning point in my life. Our protests changed the lives as well as influenced other campus demonstrations and occupations across the country that followed. As college students, we took a stand, and some of us never lost the sense of ourselves as the activists we became because of that experience. After Hamilton Hall in 1968, many of us, having witnessed and taken physical and political action, would be better equipped to be leaders and agitators. J. Plunky Blanche is a jazz and soul saxophonist, producer, songwriter, documentary filmmaker, educator, and political activist living in Richmond, Virginia. In 2015, he was recognized by the Library of Virginia as one of the strong men and women in Virginia history. His book, Plunky, Juju, Jazz, Funk, and Oneness, a musical memoir, was published in 2016.